Sarah Chen pressed her finger against the cold screen of her tablet, zooming in for the 100th time on the grainy image that had arrived from Kathmandu 3 hours earlier. Her coffee had completely cooled, a film of oil forming on the surface, but she didn't notice. The Associated Press London bureau was immersed in the typical silence of 2 a.m., only the low hum of computers and the distant rumble of the heater breaking the quiet that seemed to press against her temples. The photograph showed a human face emerging from the ice, preserved by the altitude and extreme cold of Everest. But it wasn't just any face. It was the face of Mark Webb, the British guide who had disappeared 4 years earlier, along with 5 other climbers during what should have been a routine expedition. Sarah knew every line of that face, every scar left by the wind and decades of experience in the world's most dangerous mountains. She knew because she had spent 3 years of her life sharing a bed with him, dreaming of adventures she never had the courage to live. Her phone vibrated on the desk, making her jump. David Morrison's name flashed on the screen. She had saved his contact that way one angry night after he canceled a meeting to discuss the investigation into the disappearances for the 5th time. Morrison was the international editor, a middle-aged man with perpetually smoky breath and a cruel tendency to turn human tragedies into sensationalist headlines. "Chen, have you seen the images?" Morrison's voice was too excited for the hour. "I need a full story by 6 a.m. Human angle, emotional impact, you know the drill." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block the irritation rising in her throat like bile. "David, I need more time. This isn't just a story. Mark was your boyfriend. I know. That's why you're perfect to write about him. Nothing like a personal perspective to sell papers." The silence that followed was thick with a contained violence that Sarah felt in her clenched fists. Morrison didn't know, nobody knew, that she was the last person to speak to Mark before the expedition. He didn't know about the terrible fight they had, about the words she could never take back, about the real reason he had decided to accept that suicidal mission on Everest. "I'm going to Kathmandu," she said, hanging up before he could protest. The flight to Nepal lasted 16 interminable hours, enough time for Sarah to revisit every moment of her last days with Mark. She had kept the memories like shards of glass, sharp but too precious to discard. The argument about commitment, about her never being willing to take real risks, about how he was tired of loving someone who lived in fear. "You write about adventure, Sarah, but you never live it," he had said, the words like knives. "Maybe it's time you decided if you want a real life or just to observe the lives of others." At Tribhuvan Airport, the smell of incense and kerosene mixed together brought an avalanche of memories she had tried to bury. Sarah had been there before, covering a rescue expedition 3 years earlier. That's when she met Mark, when he saved her from a fall during a seemingly safe walk to base camp. Journalists, he had laughed, holding her steady as she regained her balance. Always underestimate the mountain. Tenzin Norbu waited for her in the arrivals area, a small, wiry man whose face bore the serenity typical of Sherpas and the specific concern of someone who had spent weeks searching for bodies the mountain didn't want to return. Sarah recognized him from the photographs Mark always showed. Tenzin had been his partner in dozens of climbs, the man he trusted most in the world. "Miss Chen," Tenzin said, pressing his palms together in greeting. "Very sad to meet you like this." On the drive to Kathmandu, Tenzin recounted the discovery. A group of German climbers had found the bodies in an area known as the Death Zone, over 8,000 meters above sea level, in a rocky depression that was invisible from most routes. The strange thing was that they were all together, as if they had died at the same time, and there were signs that they had set up a makeshift camp. "It doesn't make sense," Tenzin murmured, his eyes fixed on the bumpy road. Mark knew the mountain. He wouldn't get caught in a storm, not with the others. The hotel in Tamil smelled of damp wood and spices, a scent that should have been comforting but made Sarah's stomach clench. She dropped her luggage on the narrow bed and turned on her laptop, connecting to the unreliable internet to download all available reports on the lost expedition. The names repeated themselves like a litany of the dead. Mark Webb, 34, British guide. Elena Vasquez, 29, Spanish climber. James Liu, 31, Canadian doctor. Petra Anderson, 27, Norwegian photographer. Michael O'Connor, 35, Irish businessman, and David Kim, 26, American student. But there was something about the photographs of the bodies that deeply disturbed her. They were all facing the same direction, as if they had died watching something, and their hands, all the visible hands in the images, were intertwined, forming a kind of circle. The next morning, Sarah took a helicopter to Everest Base Camp. The pilot, a young Nepali man with mirrored sunglasses, shouted over the roar of the blades that she would only have 2 hours before the next flight back. The altitude and weather made it dangerous to stay longer. Base camp was a controlled chaos of colorful tents and equipment scattered across the dirty ice. Sarah looked for Dr. Pemba Sherpa, the doctor in charge of rescues in the region. She found him in a makeshift medical tent, examining the few belongings recovered with the bodies. "Very strange, Doctor," Pemba said, showing her a backpack that had belonged to Elena Vasquez. "They had enough food, proper equipment, medicine. They didn't die of hunger or cold." Sarah picked up a damp notebook from the table. The pages stuck together, but she managed to open it to some of Elena's notes, written in a nervous scrawl. Day 3. Mark is acting strange. Keeps talking about voices. James says it's the altitude, but I hear them too. Something is calling us up the mountain. "May I take this?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. Dr. Pemba hesitated. "You were friends with them, Mark." "Mark was special to me." The doctor nodded slowly, as if understanding more than she was saying. "Take it, but be careful, Miss Chen. The mountain holds many secrets. Some are best left buried in the ice." Back at the hotel, Sarah spent the night transcribing the legible entries from Elena's notebook. The entries became increasingly fragmented and disturbing as the days went on. On day 5, Elena had written, "David disappeared in the middle of the night. Mark says he went to look for him, but he came back alone. Says David chose to stay. What does that mean? And why is Mark smiling?" On day 6, "I can't trust anyone anymore." Petra took pictures of something she shouldn't have. When I asked her what it was, she just laughed and said I'd understand soon. "James has been medicating us all with something. Says it's for altitude, but it makes me feel different. And in the last legible entry, they want me to listen too. Mark says it's beautiful, that he finally understands why the mountain calls him. I'm going up with them today. If anyone finds this, don't come looking for us. It's not safe." A chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature ran down Sarah's spine. She grabbed her phone and called Morrison in London. "Chen, what time is it there? Do you have the story?" "David, I need more time. Something is wrong with this story. The bodies, the positions, the notes. Sarah, you're starting to sound like a conspiracy theorist. Write about the dead boyfriend, publish the tragedy, and come home." "They didn't die by accident," she insisted. "There was something on the mountain, something that made them climb when they should have come down." Morrison sighed loudly on the other end of the line. "Look, I understand this is personal for you, but I can't publish science fiction. If you can't write a factual story, I'll give it to another reporter." Sarah slammed the phone down hard enough to crack the screen. If Morrison didn't want the truth, she would find it herself, and if she uncovered something truly significant, it might interest other outlets that valued real investigative journalism. At this point, I want to make a special request to you who are following this story. If you are feeling the same curiosity and tension that I felt while investigating these mysteries, subscribe to our channel right now and activate the notification bell, because stories like this, which blend reality and inexplicable elements, which make us question what we really know about the world, are exactly the type of content you will find here regularly. Don't miss the next investigations. Your curiosity deserves answers, and I'm here to find them with you. The next morning, Tenzin appeared at the hotel with a grim expression. "Miss Chen, I need to show you something, but it's not safe." He took her to a small house on the outskirts of Kathmandu, where an elderly woman named Dolma awaited them. The house smelled of yak butter and incense, and every surface was covered with photographs of mountaineers, offerings, and faded prayer flags. Dolma is the sister of the late Ang Dorji, Tenzin explained. He was a Sherpa on the expedition that disappeared. Dolma spoke in Nepali for several minutes, gesturing intensely. Tenzin translated with visible reluctance. She says Ang Dorji called her the night before he disappeared. He was scared. He said the climbers had found something on the mountain, something ancient, a cave with drawings on the walls. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of drawings? More urgent Nepali, human figures in a circle, and something in the center. Ang Dorji said the climbers became obsessed after seeing the drawings. They stopped listening to the Sherpas, stopped following the safe routes. Dolma rose and went to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She withdrew a yellowed envelope and handed it to Sarah with trembling hands. Inside were 3 faded Polaroid photographs. The first showed the interior of a cave lit by lanterns, with walls covered in petroglyphs that looked thousands of years old. The second was a close-up of the circular figures Dolma had mentioned, people holding hands, facing a central form that Sarah couldn't identify. The third photograph made her gasp. It was Mark, but a Mark she had never seen. His eyes were wide, and he was smiling in a way that seemed simultaneously euphoric and empty. Behind him, partially visible in the darkness of the cave, were the other members of the expedition, all with the same unsettling expression. When was this taken? Sarah asked. Tenzin consulted Dolma again. 2 nights before the disappearance. Ang Dorji hid the photos before going up with them for the last time. Sarah studied the images until her eyes burned. There was something about the petroglyphs, something that stirred a primitive part of her brain. The figures seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and the longer she stared, the more she felt a strange need to understand what they represented. Dolma says you shouldn't have seen this. Tenzin murmured, says some things should remain buried in the ice. But Sarah was past the point of no return. Tenzin, can you take me to the cave? The Sherpa shook his head vigorously. Impossible, too dangerous, and even if it were safe. He paused, looking at the photographs with visible disgust. Even if it were safe, I wouldn't. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mark's vacant smile in the photograph. She got up several times to look at the images again, and with each viewing, she felt more connected to the cave drawings, as if they were trying to tell her something important. At 3 in the morning, she made a decision that would change everything. Using her journalistic contacts, Sarah managed to locate a guide willing to take her to the region where the bodies were found. Karma Tenzing was a 40-year-old man with a controversial history. He had lost 2 clients in avalanches and had a reputation for accepting missions that other guides considered suicidal, as long as the payment was sufficient. Miss Chen, he said when they met at a cafe in Namche Bazaar, you understand that this might be our last conversation. Sarah nodded, feigning a confidence she didn't feel. I understand the risks. Karma studied her face for a long moment. No, you don't, but let's go anyway. The ascent began before dawn. Sarah had lied about her mountaineering experience. Her only climbs had been in London gyms and on a romantic trip with Mark to the Scottish Highlands. The thin air made her dizzy after the first 1,000 meters, and her legs trembled under the weight of the backpack full of equipment she barely knew how to use. Karma proved to be an efficient but uncommunicative guide. He seemed genuinely disturbed by the mission, constantly checking the communication equipment and looking at the sky with a frequency that Sarah found excessive. On the second day, when they set up camp at 6,000 meters, Sarah finally asked what was bothering him. Have you heard of spiritual mountain sickness? Karma asked, nervously stirring a cup of butter tea. Sarah shook her head. It's different from common altitude sickness. It happens when people stay too long in certain areas of the mountain. They start to hear things, see things. My grandfather used to say that some parts of Everest are inhabited. Inhabited by what? Karma didn't answer, just pointed to the distant peak shining under the starlight. Tomorrow we reach where they found your friends. After that, you decide if you want to continue to the cave. Sarah woke up in the early hours of the third day, with the feeling that someone was whispering her name. The wind was shaking the tent hard enough to make it creak, but between the gusts, she could swear she heard a familiar voice, a voice that sounded exactly like Mark's. Karma was already awake when she came out of the tent, his eyes fixed on a specific direction on the mountain. You heard it too, he said. It wasn't a question. Heard what? But even as she denied it, Sarah felt an almost magnetic pull in the direction Karma was looking. Every fiber of her being wanted to follow that path, climb higher, find the source of the voices that now sounded like a distant melodious choir. This is where they were found, Karma said when they reached a rocky depression 2 hours later. The site had been cleared by the rescue team, but Sarah could still see the marks where the tents were pitched, the remnants of campfire, the depressions in the snow, where bodies had lain for 4 years. What struck her most was the feeling of peace in the place, not the peace of death, but something deeper, as if this were a sacred place. The cave is 300 meters from here, Karma said reluctantly, but Miss Chen, I beg you to reconsider. Sarah was already walking in the direction he had indicated. The whisper in her mind had become clearer, more insistent. It wasn't just Mark's voice now, she could distinguish other voices, all calling her name, all promising answers to questions she didn't even know she had. The entrance to the cave was smaller than she had imagined, a triangular opening in the rock that barely allowed one person to pass. Sarah turned on her flashlight and began to descend. The interior of the cave opened into a circular chamber that seemed to have been modified by human hands. The walls were covered with the petroglyphs she had seen in the photographs, but seeing them in person was completely different. The drawings seemed to pulse under the light of her flashlight, and the longer she looked at them, the more complex they became. In the center of the chamber was a depression in the stone floor, filled with objects she couldn't immediately identify. She approached and saw that they were personal belongings, watches, wallets, photographs, jewelry, hundreds of them, as if people had been coming there for decades or centuries, leaving offerings. And in the middle of it all, she recognized Mark's watch, the Rolex she had given him as a birthday present 2 years ago. Sarah, she turned quickly, but there was no one in the cave. Mark's voice had sounded as real as if he were standing behind her. Sarah, you finally came. This time the voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah pressed her back against the rock, her heart beating so hard she could hear it echoing in the chamber. You didn't have to die, she whispered to the darkness. You didn't have to climb. But I didn't die, Sarah. None of us died. We found something much bigger. The voices now came from all directions. Mark, Elena, James, the others, all speaking at the same time, but somehow Sarah could distinguish each word. You were always afraid to truly live, Mark's voice continued, but here you can be part of something eternal, something beautiful. Sarah looked again at the petroglyphs, and this time she understood what they represented. They weren't just human figures in a circle, they were souls, consciousnesses, being absorbed by something greater. And the central form was not a creature or a god, but a representation of the mountain itself, alive and conscious. No, she murmured, backing towards the cave entrance. This isn't real. But even as she denied it, she felt the pull growing stronger. It would be so easy to join them, to become part of the mountain, to never again feel loneliness, or fear, or regret, never again to worry about deadlines, or cruel editors, or relationships ending in bitter arguments. Sarah, Karma's voice echoed from outside the cave. You need to get out now. Storm's coming. The interruption broke the trance that was forming. Sarah rushed to the entrance, but before she left, she glanced one last time at the petroglyphs. For a moment, she was absolutely certain that the figures etched on the wall had shifted position, and that a new figure, one that looked just like her, had appeared in the circle. The storm hit with full force when they were halfway to the camp. Sarah could barely see Karma ahead of her, the snow whipping her face like 1,000 icy needles. But worse than the cold or the difficulty breathing were the voices that kept following her, growing more insistent with every step she took away from the cave. "You always run when things get interesting," Marcus's voice sneered, now laced with a malice she'd never heard before. "You ran from me, you're running now, but you can't run forever." Karma pulled her into a makeshift emergency tent he'd erected against the slope of a rock. He was breathing heavily, and when he removed his goggles, Sarah saw that his eyes were wide with terror. "They're coming," he whispered. "I can feel them in the storm." "Who's coming?" But before he could answer, the storm stopped. It didn't gradually subside, it simply ceased, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise. Sarah opened the tent flap and looked out. The mountain was bathed in a silvery light that didn't come from the sun or the moon, but seemed to emanate from the snow itself. And walking toward them, with slow but determined movements, were the silhouettes of 6 figures. "Marcus," she whispered. Even from a distance, she could recognize the way he walked, the angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. But something was wrong with all of them. Their movements were too synchronized, too mechanical, like puppets controlled by the same hand. "Don't look at them," Karma murmured, pulling her back inside the tent. "If you look too long, they'll take you." But Sarah couldn't stop watching. The closer they got, the more she could see details that shouldn't have been visible. Their faces were exactly as she had known them in life, but their eyes were completely black, like bottomless pits. "Sarah," Marcus's voice now came from outside the tent, so close she could feel the air move with his words. "Come with us. You always said you wanted a real adventure." Karma was praying softly in Nepali, his hands trembling, as he lit incense on a small portable altar. The sweet scent of the smoke seemed to create an invisible barrier between them and the voices outside. "Why are you afraid of us?" It was Elena's voice now. "We're at peace, happier than we ever were in life." "The mountain loves us," James added. "She wants you too, Sarah. She's always wanted you." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but when she did, the memories came even stronger. Every happy moment she'd shared with Marcus, every laugh, every plan they'd made for the future, and mixed in with the good memories were the bad ones. The last fight, the cruel words, the feeling that she had pushed him towards this deadly expedition with her refusal to commit. "You blame yourself for my death," Marcus said, as if he could read her thoughts. "But you don't have to carry that guilt. Join us, and everything will be forgiven." "It's not him," Karma whispered urgently. "What's talking to you isn't your Marcus. It's the mountain using his form." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the Sherpa. "How do you know?" "Because I've lost people like this before. The mountain collects souls, Sarah, and it uses them to lure others." Outside, the voices began to sing, a melody Sarah didn't recognize, but that made every cell in her body vibrate with an almost uncontrollable desire to join the chorus. "We need to get down now," Karma said, beginning to pack up their gear, "before you're taken too." But as Sarah stood to help him, she realized she didn't want to go down. The thought of returning to London, to her empty life of superficial relationships and articles about other people's adventures, seemed unbearably monotonous compared to the promise of eternity the voices offered. "Sarah, no." Karma grabbed her arm as she started to walk toward the tent flap. "Fight it." "Why should I fight it?" she asked, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. "They're offering everything I've ever wanted: adventure, belonging, a chance to be with Marcus again."
"That's not Marcus," Karma yelled. "Marcus has been dead for 4 years. That's something that wants your soul." The violence of the statement was like a bucket of cold water. Sarah blinked, and for a moment the fog that had formed in her mind dissipated. She looked at her own hands and saw that they were trembling uncontrollably. "What's happening to me? The mountain is trying to seduce you, like it did them, but you can still resist." The voices outside shifted in tone, becoming more insistent, almost angry. "Sarah, you're disappointing us. We've waited so long for you." "Don't listen," Karma said, pulling her further into the tent. "Focus on why you came here. You came to find the truth about what happened to them." The truth. Sarah forced herself to think clearly. She was a journalist. She had dedicated her life to uncovering truths, even the uncomfortable ones. And the truth here was that something on the mountain had captured the souls of the lost climbers, and now wanted to capture hers as well. "How do we get out of here?" she asked. Karma pointed to an opening at the back of the tent. "Quick descent. Don't look back. Don't listen to the voices, and pray we reach base camp before they catch us." Sarah nodded, but as they started to move, the voices became desperate, almost human in their anguish. "Sarah, please." Marcus sounded like he was crying. "I need you. I love you." She stopped, her heart breaking. It was exactly what she had always wanted to hear him say, the words he'd never managed to utter in life. "It's not him," she whispered to herself. "It's not him." But a part of her wanted to believe. A part of her wanted to turn and run into the arms of what seemed to be Marcus, even knowing it would be her death. The descent was a race through a nightmare. The voices followed them for miles, alternating between desperate pleas and veiled threats. Sarah could see shadows moving in her peripheral vision, always out of focus, always almost familiar. When they finally reached base camp, the sun was rising, and the voices began to fade like morning mist. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, collapsing onto a rock. Karma shook her head. "For you maybe, but they're still up there, and they always will be." Sarah looked at the mountain one last time, before boarding the helicopter back to Kathmandu. For a moment, she was certain she could see 6 figures standing on a distant ridge, watching her leave. Back in London, Sarah wrote her story, but it wasn't the story Morrison expected. Instead of focusing on the personal tragedy, she wrote about high-altitude psychological phenomena, about how isolation and oxygen deprivation can create convincing collective hallucinations. She mentioned theories about geological power points, and how certain rock formations can affect the human brain. It was all technically true, but it omitted the deeper truth she had discovered. Some stories, she had learned, were too big and too dangerous to be told completely. Sarah closed her eyes, and for the first time since arriving in Nepal, allowed herself to fully hear the mountain's voices. They weren't haunting or alien, they were human, warm, welcoming. They were the voices of people who had found exactly what she was looking for. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer alone in the cave. Elena was there, and James, and the Germans, and dozens of others who had made the same choice over the years, all real, all alive in a way that transcended the physical definition of life. And in the petroglyphs on the wall, a new figure had appeared, a woman with long hair, and an expression of absolute peace. Finally home. Down below, at base camp, Tenzin gazed at the mountain with concern. The helicopter sent to pick up Sarah Chen hadn't been able to locate her, and a storm was brewing. In a few days, when the weather cleared, he would organize a search party. They would find her camp untouched, her footprints leading to the cave that locals had avoided for generations. And when they finally entered the circular chamber, they would see a new drawing on the walls, a figure that looked familiar, surrounded by others in an eternal circle of understanding. But Sarah wasn't lost. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.